Well, good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled The Road to Continuous Improvement and Training. And for those of you that have not been involved in these webinars, we've actually started these several months ago, and we're really working our way through all of the elements of PSM. So we really kind of started out, like I said, about 2 months ago, and each month we picked a specific topic within PSM to discuss and kind of look at where the gaps might be and what are the things that you can do in a facility to address some of these. As we started out, and kind of just give you a quick recap, we started out with management systems, and those management systems should define the things that we are supposed to do. Those things that for the most part would assign responsibility and accountability to those people within your organization who have responsibility or accountability or actions to take in various parts of your PSM or RMP program. All the way down to the finest detail. The more detail that you can put in your management systems, the more likely that those things will get done. Many of our organizations, for the most part, have turnover. In fact, you know, if you go in the ammonia refrigeration industry, there's a lot more turnover than in most facilities, and those are the things that we want to make sure we have management systems in place to address those things when they occur. And that's what the management system does. Most of the time we talk here about doing a RACI. A RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consult, and Inform. And it kind of defines who those people are, who is the one that has to do the thing, who is the person or persons that we want to consult with and inform, et cetera. And at the end of the day, who is accountable for making sure that those things are done. Again, if somebody in your organization moves or is replaced, it's easy to hand them that RACI and say, these are the things that you're accountable for and responsible for in your organization. And just want to make sure we've had somebody here chime in here. Can everybody mute their mics for now, please? Or I'm going to probably mute everybody for now as well, if I can. All right. So, and we'll open up the mics here a little bit later for questions. So as of now, I've got everybody muted. Hopefully, Keith, you don't have that feedback now, okay? All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about in our recap is employee participation. So we took the first element of PSM, and for those of you that might have been here for that, I emphasize the fact that probably of all of the elements with PSM, employee participation is by far, in my opinion, one of the most important ones. If we don't have people involved in your processes and making sure that you have good programs, good process safety information, good procedures, everything in place, none of the other stuff really matters because it's not going to be up to date, it's not going to be current, it's not going to be accurate. And we all know if you're dealing with that bad information, normally going to get bad results. So we want to make sure that that's the most important part of your PSM program is employee participation. Employee participation is not a document. So many people will hand me a document when I ask about employee participation. They'll say, well, here's our employee participation plan, and that's fine. But it has to go beyond some plan. It has to go beyond some written piece of paper. It actually has to be something that you implement and actually do in your facilities. And we're going to talk through some of those issues, even when we talk about training today, how we can get people and your organization involved in participating in training. The next thing we talked about is process safety information and the importance of that. We have really three parts of PSI, or process safety information, and those are information on the hazards of the chemicals, Most of the facilities will get that through their SDS or safety data sheets, but there's a lot of other facilities that will not have that information readily available through an SDS. For example, if you're in the chemical industry, you may have chemicals that don't have an SDS formulated for because they're intermediate, or there's some other chemical that isn't actually sold as a finished product, but yet they're hazardous. We still need all of the toxicity information and all the hazards associated with those chemicals, even if they're not a finished product. The next thing within PSI is information on the technology of the process itself. I always tell people it's very important to understand what is in this particular element. And you'll see in a lot of documentation in facilities where they'll mix these things up a little bit, especially as it pertains to safe upper and lower limits. Safe upper and lower limits is part of the process safety information and technology of the process. And I put process in quotes here because we're really dealing with the process at this point. We're dealing with the design intent of the process. It has nothing to do with equipment, etc. That is the next part of PSI. The next part of PSI is information pertaining to the equipment. If you have the information on the technology of the process, and you have the information on the hazards of the chemical correct and formulated correct, then the information that you would use to design that equipment would be exactly that information, the hazards of the chemical and the technology of the process. For example, if you had a process that if I add component A to component B and I had a exothermic reaction, meaning the temperature is going to rise, maybe the pressure rises as well, we would like to know that information so we know what that endpoint of pressure is, what that endpoint of temperature is, so that we can design our equipment accordingly. So that's why information on the technology of the process does not have anything really to do with operating limits or anything like that at this point in time. It really has to do with process information, design information. What did the original process design engineer actually have in mind, or the chemist have in mind in terms of design? Of course, then the next thing we looked at is process hazards analysis and the PHA. The importance of making sure that we're addressing all of the potential hazards that we may have in our process. Obviously, for those of you that might be in ammonia refrigeration, this is fairly easy, and I don't want to, relegate ammonia refrigeration as a simple thing, because it's not. There are a number of hazards that have to be addressed in ammonia refrigeration, just like there would be in oil and gas and in the petrochemical industry and refining. But again, the PHA is only good as the information that you use to conduct it. So if your P&IDs, if your process safety information and other information that you need is not correct and up to date, so the PHA is going to actually reflect those results as well. The next thing we talked about and spent some time, actually I think we had 2 sessions on, and that was operating procedures. Since operating procedures contains safe work practices too, we kind of divided that up into 2 different webinars, and really talked about operating procedures themselves and the different elements and the requirements, and not only the requirements, but trying to understand the intent of each of those requirements within operating procedures. And then we spent some time, a good deal of time, talking about safe work practices. Unfortunately, we do a lot of, first of all, fortunately, we do a lot of compliance audits, but unfortunately, the information we tend to get out of those is safe work practices still have a long ways to go. There's a lot of training that still needs to be done on safe work practices and understanding those, especially when it comes to a lockout, tagout, some confined space, and then also line breaking procedures as well. So today we're going to be talking about training. But before we talk about that, I just want to go back and reiterate something here. And there's reasons why the PSM standard, and of course the RMP standard for that matter, is designed the way it is in terms of why element one is employee participation, why the next one is process safety information, why the next one is process hazards analysis, etc. Because these are all important parts of design. If you go through a design process, the first thing that you do is you develop and assign a project team or a team that's going to actually design that. That's employee participation. And any good process design engineer will tell you that for a project to be successful, you need the best people from all different areas within that team. That means operators, that means engineers, that means technicians, etc. Getting the best people involved, make sure that you will come out of that with the best process, and making sure that process starts up with very few issues, and of course starts up safely as well. So I really want to kind of go through now the actual elements within the PSMS standard itself. And I'm not going to read every one of these. I assume most of those that are here today have probably read the standard, so you know what's required here. But I will kind of hit the highlights here just so that we understand those as we go forward, why I'm saying the things that I'm saying need to be done. The first is each employee presently involved in operating a process, and each employee before being involved in operating a newly assigned process shall be trained in the overview of the process, in the operating procedures, and specified in paragraph F of this section. Paragraph F includes the safe work practices, etc. And of course, every element within the SOP as well. So new employee comes on board, they need to be trained in not only safe work practices, but within each element of your SOP and how they apply to that process in which they'll be operating or be involved. The next part is a lieu of initial training for these employees already involved in operating processes. May 1992, employer may certify in writing that the employee has required knowledge. Really, for the most part, this is well beyond. There's not too many people anymore that have not had some at least refresher training, I hope, since they started operating their processes, and very little value anymore in this particular element. Now, here's one that I see quite often that gets a lot of attention, but I'm not sure people totally understand this. Refresher training shall be provided at least, and I think the key words here are at least every 3 years, and more often if necessary. The thing I want to reiterate here is that the employee has to understand and adhere to the operating procedures of the process. One of the things that you can take out of this is the fact that if you have incidents in your facilities, if you've had releases, or if you've had somebody hurt or something to that effect, inevitably, if you're doing a good job of doing your analysis, your root cause analysis of the incident, then what you're going to normally get out of that is a causal factor that has to do with training. And for the most part, I've yet to do incident investigation where some causal factor or root cause didn't point to some type of training or lack of understanding of the training they're provided. So refresher training would be included in here as well. Of course, training documentation, the employer shall ascertain that each employee involved in operating a process has received and understood the training required by this paragraph. In other words, we have to do something to determine whether or not the people that we've trained actually understood and can apply the training that what they've been given in the way that we intended. Some would say, well, this is a quiz or this is a test. And yes, for the most part, it can be that, but it should be some blended element as well. Blended meaning provide the training, provide the quiz, and then maybe some follow-up and actually see that they're actually applying what they learned in the classroom or through the training that was provided. So again, let's just real quickly just talk about the purpose and intent of this particular element in PSM. The first, to ensure operating personnel have the proper training, obviously. The second is to ensure that operating personnel training is documented. And then it's also to ensure operating personnel understood the training they were provided. And of course, ensure training is ongoing and is updated as needed. So if you're providing the same training year in and year out to employees, they're probably not getting better at their job. They're just hearing the same thing over and over again. So training needs to be updated. It needs to be improved. And that's the whole cycle of continuous improvement, in which really encompasses PSM itself. So here are some common gaps that we see. We've done well over 250 inspections from a PSM standpoint, and using actually the OSHA's NEP type program to do these type of inspections. And these are some common gaps that we see. The first one is training is just the checkbox. We can look at training, we can see documentation of training, we can see that the employees have had their training, but when we do the actual interviews of employees, we ask specific questions to really ascertain the understanding of the training that they provided, that goes well beyond asking a simple question of, do you know what lockout tagout is? But we may go into more specifics on actually having them do a lockout tagout procedure right in front of us. So it really helps us to understand, do they really understand the concepts rather than just being able to answer a question on a quiz. Training is limited to operations personnel only and not contractors. So the requirement is, if you have lockout tagout training and hot work training for your employees, and your contractors are expected to follow your lockout tagout and your hot work procedures, then they need to be trained on your procedures. I'm not necessarily saying that you need to provide that training, but you need to make sure that they have been provided that training, that they understood that training, just as well as you've decided or ascertained that your own employees have received and understand that training. The next thing I talk about is training is not comprehensive. So what that means is they may be given a CBT. For example, nothing wrong with CBTs. You can give them a CBT, but then there has to be some portion of that training that actually allows the employee to ask questions and be able to determine whether or not they really understood what training you've been provided or they've been provided. A lot of the training we see is specifically, and this is probably more predominant in the ammonia refrigeration industry, is they'll be given 2 to 3 weeks of training off-site. Maybe we send them to their training facilities, I think at Garden City, ammonia. There's a couple of others that they actually can go to, and they may get 1, 2, 3 weeks of training, and that's basically it. They get a certificate, and then that's it. That's not enough. It may be limited day-to-day operations only, and it lacks in-depth knowledge. We need to ask the questions a little bit deeper than that. So we need to ask questions like, why, for example, does this piece of equipment show high pressure or high temperature in these situations? And start asking those sort of questions. It makes the operator, makes technician start to think through. They learn from those type of issues. The second thing is lack of emergency planning and practice. That is training. So a lot of people, for example, and this is one of my better examples I like to use, is hazmat or HAZWOPER training. A lot of people will say, I get 8 hours of refresher training every year. And for the most part, that's good. But what is that 8-hour refresher training? Is it sitting in a classroom going over things that you went over last year and the year before? Or is it actually doing what you're expected to do in an emergency? For example, going beyond putting on the equipment that's actually going to address a mock emergency, shutting off some valves, or actually rescuing someone, etc., depending on what you're going to do. The more practice, the more training that you get, the more likely when you have a real incident, if it doesn't turn into a recovery and it stays a rescue. Training gets you there. Practice gets you there. So that's all training. It lacks occupational safety and health understanding and application. You know, we talked about lockout, tagout, for example. We talked about line break. Do people really understand what a line break is? We do PSM training quite often, and normally I will give an example of just a simple pump or a simple valve that has to be replaced, and do a lockout, tagout, and also do a line break. Normally people don't get the line break correct. Whenever you open a system, that means opening a bleed valve, opening a valve that is opening, that has the potential to release a hazardous chemical to the atmosphere. That is a line break, and we need to treat it as such. Oftentimes I will joke to people that valves, block valves, always work, correct? We know that that's not true. Valves are notoriously bad about leaking by, or notoriously bad about not holding 100%. So if you're relying and trusting on a valve to keep you from being exposed, then that's a problem right now that has to be addressed. You should always assume, and we always assume in a line break scenario, that the worst thing can happen. Valves do not hold, flanges, etc., do not hold, etc., unless we have a slip blind or a actual blind installed. Next thing is poor to no incident investigations to identify real causal factors. Typically, we'll see incident investigations that are very done on a surface, just looking at the obvious things, and we need to look beyond that. We need to look at other causal factors, parts of our management systems that are broke, that need to be fixed and need to be addressed. Typically, they will always have some type of training element that we need to train better on. The last one is just a failure to survey employees regarding training needs. How many of us, for example, will actually survey our employees to see whether or not they need any more training? So some of the characteristics of training is it's necessary for all workers and contractors, that we talked about just a little bit ago. When to train is obviously the initial training. For when that first time that employee comes on board, they need to be fully trained in all aspects of the process. It should be some type of PSM training to really talk about the intent of PSM, not necessarily focusing on the regulation itself so much, but focusing on the intent of each of those elements, and see how they apply and how their jobs can actually help improve the process safety within your organization. And it will help if you can make sure that all of your employees have a good understanding of process safety and those things that we need to do to ensure all of our fellow workers go home safe as well. Of course, anytime you change a work assignment, then training is going to have to be redone as well and retrained as well. So we want to make sure that all employees have retraining or are trained when they switch jobs or positions. Other is refresher training every 3 years or when the following occur. And these are just the minimum requirements. An incident indicates the root cause or causal factors related to training. And like I said, in most of the incident investigations that I've ever led, there's always a causal factor that will point to some type of training, whether that's for a technician, that's for an engineer, that's to an operator, it can be to management, etc. There's always a training element that always appears. If you do a good job of doing an incident investigation, those will always show up. An employee requests refresher training or training on specific tasks that they have to do, or a task is only performed on special occasions or infrequently, such as a turnaround. So, for example, some facilities only go through a turnaround or a major shutdown where they replace equipment every 5 years. So certainly we would want to make sure that all the operators and all the people that are involved in that turnaround are trained prior to going through that turnaround. Same way for maybe industries that work in ammonia refrigeration. Let's say that you're only doing, for example, every 42 months you're changing coalescing filters in your compressor. Well, that would be something that we'd want to make sure that people are trained on how to pump down that compressor, etc., when that time occurs. So we want to make sure that that training is fresh in their mind when they're actually going to do the task. The next thing that we want to keep in mind is they need to be trained on operations and associated procedures. And what I mean by associated procedures, not only the safe work practices that we're talking about here in a second, but those procedures that really have to do with things outside of normal operations. Maybe you have checklists, maybe you have procedures, for example, changing filter elements we just talked about. Filters get changed in just about every industry. We want to make sure people are trained in that operation, because those are times when our employees are the most susceptible to getting injured or getting exposed to those highly hazardous chemicals. So those are the best times to get trained. It's also the best time to actually have a mentor or a coach or a supervisor actually watch a person actually doing those tasks, so that they can make sure that they're doing as the procedure has outlined them, or maybe you find out the procedure isn't exactly right and there are safer, more efficient ways of doing that task. The other thing is just safe work practices and making sure that lockout tagout is being adhered to. Making sure hot work is being done according to your policies and procedures. And I know that in many of our audits that we do, we find issues almost every time in hot work and line equipment and opening, like we said. Also, lockout tagout. Lockout tagout, for those of you who don't know, lockout tagout has been in existence just as long as PSM. So, but you know, when it comes down to the number one reason for people still getting hurt, it's lockout tagout, because people still do not understand a lockout tagout. In fact, we were at a facility just a couple of weeks ago where we were doing an audit, and I looked at a lockout tagout, and none of the equipment had locks on. They had put a tag on the valves. They put a tag on the main breakers, but each of them had a place to put a lock, but yet their policy and procedure didn't address the use of tags and the use of the fact that there were more safer methods of doing that lockout tagout than using a tag. Again, we already talked about line and equipment opening. And of course, confined space is another area. Confined space has a lot of issues in terms of not understanding confined spaces, not understanding and identifying those spaces. What is a permit required confined space versus what is just a confined space? And I think a lot of times people need to understand, and we need to take a step back and look at, first of all, defining, is it a confined space? And then take the next step to determine whether or not it's permitted. And then if it is permitted, what are those things that you have to do to adhere to the confined space requirements? The next thing is emergency response. And we kind of touched base on this just a little bit in terms of so just before I go on to that, we have a question here. It says, how often should JHAs be reviewed or redone if nothing's changed. I recommend that a JHA be reviewed every time it's about to be used, especially if it's being used by people with different backgrounds, or different people are actually using that. A lot of times different eyes see different things. And for the most part, if I'm doing a task, and if I review the JHA and I give that to somebody else, to do that task a couple of weeks later, they're going to look at the JHA and they may find other things that have to be addressed. So I would recommend that those JHAs be reviewed every time before they're actually getting used. For the most part, there may be some JHAs that get used every day, and those should be part of your SOP and everything else as well. So they could be also pulled in to your SOP and made like a procedure. Now they're actually being reviewed at least annually, or should be, and certified that they are correct. The next thing we want to talk about is just training on operating procedures. And of course, they need to be trained. All your operators need to be trained on all the operating phases. I know in some industries, some of the phases don't make any sense. For example, you may not have an emergency shutdown phase for a specific piece of equipment, etc. Well, you still need to document that and still train your employees to make sure that they understand that as well. So I got another question here. For emergency response, can you discuss the EPA's 68.93 emergency response coordination activities? Yes, for the most part, what we need to do for your emergency response is you need to coordinate that with especially if you're doing emergency action plan, where you're having your hazmat team coming from an outside source or a third-party contractor, etc. You need to get with those individuals or individual organizations and invite them in, kind of show them what they have to do, and then coordinate some practices and drills. The last thing that obviously we want to happen is we have a real emergency, and that's the first time that your emergency crews are showing up. Regardless, even as I said earlier, even in the case where you're providing your own emergency response team, for example, you have your own hazmat team, as part of your training, that 8-hour refresher training, like I said earlier, those should be on practices on real live events, or not real live incidents, but actually something that you would expect them to respond to. For example, another example would be where you're doing your own rescue on confined space entry. That should be a practice that team is actually going through to make sure that they can actually perform that rescue as you've defined it in your confined space program. It's no longer something that you should do annually, but you should. It's not required that you do it annually, but you should. It's a should, so it's not a shall. But that's something we should be doing annually. It doesn't have to be something that requires everybody to suit up. It can be a tabletop exercise, etc. But again, we want it where this is not the first time that they're actually doing these things when they show up for a real emergency. I know that EPA has wanted to make that a mandatory thing, but I think that was reversed back in this past year. The other thing we're going to talk about is initial startup, normal temporary operations. These are all part of your operating phases that we need to be trained on. Operating limits, consequences of deviation, and then of course steps to avoid and correct. One of the things I want to talk about here for just a second is oftentimes I will see safe upper and lower limits as part of operating procedures. Not one and the same, totally different. Again, operating our limits are things that we specifically define as not exceeding in terms of operating our processes. So if we exceed an operating limit, then the potential is for us to reach those safe upper and lower limits as well. So operating limits all should be well within the safe upper and lower limits of the process. And here we're just talking about operating limits, so well within all of those operating requirements. The next thing is safety and health and hazards of the chemical. Obviously, these are going to be all a little bit different for safety and health concerns for the various chemicals that you might have in there as well. And then, of course, safety systems and their functions. This is one that is often left out of training. Some of the safety systems, and I'll just kind of name a few because all industries that we deal with have different safety systems, but here are some common ones. So LEL detection, lower explosive limit, those detection systems. What happens when you get an LEL alarm or a warning? What happens? What is the function? Maybe you have some deluge systems where you actually have some devices that temperature reaches so high that the deluge system starts. What is the design basis, and what is the function of that system? Ammonia detectors, maybe you have H2S detectors, maybe you have fire eyes, etc. These are all safety systems that are put in place that need to be part of your SOP or operating procedures, and outlining what those functions of those systems are and making sure that your operators are trained on what to do and how to respond should they get one of those systems alerts. So this is where I'm going to come back now to employee participation. Employee participation means everybody has to get involved. We want people, operators, technicians, we want all of those people involved in the process of training. If, for example, if one of your operators, one of your newest operators comes into your facility and they start learning the process, maybe one of the things that you can do after they've kind of been certified in that process is give them a role of teaching any new employees that specific task within your organization, going all the way from helping them to understand the process safety information associated with that, through the PHA elements that were focused on that, through the SOPs that were written for that specific item, through any JHAs or any other checklists or anything else that's associated with that particular task. That way they get the opportunity to learn it even more. And I will tell you that most of us that have done training, and there's some of us on here that have done quite a bit of training probably in our careers, will tell you that when you train, you have to spend some time in preparation. We have to prepare what we're going to talk about. And when we prepare, that means we're in the process of learning. We think through the implementation. We think through the whole process of how we're going to convey this information. That is learning for the trainer just as well as it is for the trainee. So the more people we can make trainers, trainings on specific items and tasks, the better our organizations will be. Also, we need to be requesting evaluations and evaluate our training, making sure that we're getting across the things that we're trying to get across. And of course, we're always should be revising our training. You know, I've been doing PSM training now, I guess, for maybe 20 some years, and I'm constantly revising and changing our training because I find new ways to bring across the point, new ways to that people are actually addressing different items. So we're always looking for ways to revise training. Training should be part of our management system. Remember, that was the first thing that when we talked about the road continuous improvement, that's the first thing that we talked about is our management systems and the hows and the who's of PSM in general. So training needs to be a huge part of our management system. We're always striving to improve. The other thing we have to keep in mind is the characteristics of adult learners. And I'm assuming most of us that are on here today are adults. Of course, my wife every now and then doesn't think I act like one, but for the most part, I am. But we all learn a little bit differently. Some of us through seeing and hearing. So if we see something and hear it, it tends to sink in a lot better. There are other of us that it's more about talking and writing. I'm not a big person about writing things. I'm better at talking through things and seeing things, and that helps me to learn. We're all a little bit different. We should use instructional media. Maybe that's a CBT accompanied with somebody that actually knows the subject real well is too. Have some user interaction. Just like here today, you know, we have people asking questions. That's user interaction. And those are the things that we want to incorporate in all of our training. We all know that, especially those that have trained people in the past, know that if we're doing a whole lot of talking and there's not a whole lot of response or questions getting asked, we should be asking ourselves, well, you know, am I doing a good job of providing training as well? So some of the key information I want us to take away from here today on this particular item is training on operating procedures. Has to be a big part of what we do. Obviously, training on safe work practices, refresher training at least every 3 years and after an incident, methods for requesting additional training, and then training as part of your management system. Those are the things that we've kind of talked about. Some of the best practices is conduct training reviews periodically. We should be doing a survey, for example, surveying our employees, our operators, our technicians, our engineers, et cetera, to see not only do they want additional training or what areas do they want to provide training on or want further training on. We should be reviewing our management system to ensure that training is a key element, and that's conduct a survey. Allow operators to prepare and present training. Consider blended learning. Blended learning is some classroom, it's some CBT, and some hands-on. And just like we, as adult learners, we learn in different ways, these are incorporate all of those different ways if we provide that blended learning. So if all of your training is a CBT only, then I will guarantee you that you'll be limited and your employees will be limited on their knowledge. It's more or less just to pass the test and go on. On the other hand, if it has a little bit of hands-on, then a little bit more is involved in the fact that they have to take a little bit more initiative to make sure that they understand what was in that CBT, because now they're going to have a mentor or a coach actually watching them do what they were just trained on. Again, practice emergency procedures often. You know, how to shut off equipment, how to respond to a leak, how to respond to an alarm. These are things that we should be practicing and training our employees on. Just not telling them, hey, you have an alarm here. You know, what should you do in the alarm? Actually see that they do respond in the way that they want. Also, if you have, for example, emergency procedures like shutdown procedures, making sure that employee can actually go through that process of knowing exactly what they need to do. And that's, again, a mentor or coach or somebody watching them go through that process, or at least simulating what they should be doing. Sometimes having a third party conduct training at some frequency, just another set of eyes that might be able to help you to improve your program as well. We should develop a survey that looks just at understanding of process, procedures, OSH requirements, etc. Based on the survey, develop training to address those gaps. So what I mean by this is create a survey that asks very detailed questions about what they should know, What's the intent of the training? What you trying to get across? And it has to go beyond just basic understanding. For example, most of us will probably agree if you take a CBT, most of the CBTs, we could probably answer the question without taking the training. And the whole idea there is to get 70% to pass. What if we, instead of doing that, we didn't give a grade at all and ask some of the more difficult questions that we want them to learn, and what are the key concepts within the occupational safety and health training we're trying to provide, or process knowledge that we want them to have, and then look at those responses. Don't look at a response as a yes no, but more a write-in type of answer. Then you can begin to see what areas you need further training in. Where are the gaps? Where are those areas that you can improve training on? I know most of us have a lot of things to do in our organization, and that becomes hard, but developing that survey and then updating it every 6 months, at least annually, to send it out, doesn't take that much time at all. And a huge amount of good information comes back on some of the areas that you can improve your training on. The last thing that we want is especially those in ammonia refrigeration. You have RETA, you can have the CARO or the CERO certification, continuing education, but those things are just a supplement. They're not always everything that is needed. We have a lot of folks that when we do a compliance audit, they have these certifications, but again, it goes back to understanding to be able to implement those things. We have a number of people that are degreed professionals operating plants. That doesn't necessarily mean that they understand the key concepts of process safety. No more so than when I graduated from engineering school, I knew how to do engineering. I had to get people who are good and have been doing it for a number of years to teach me, coach me, mentor me, to be able to understand a lot of the key concepts that I may have learned from a really high level in engineering school. But I've got another question here. Are you supposed to do a lockout tagout procedure when you initiate a line and equipment opening? The answer is yes. That should be part of your whole line break procedure. Now, what we have seen in the past is some people will do a lockout tagout, and then their next piece of it is line break. Well, it's pretty hard to actually conduct the whole lockout tagout without doing some type of line break in there. So, for example, and I know we don't have, maybe I can draw here. Hold on just a second. Let's see if I can do a quick drawing. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of drawing on here, and so let's say that if I have a pump, and I hope everybody can see this okay. I have a pump. I have some bleed valves on either side of that pump, and these are supposed to be valves by the way, so everybody should be able to see that, right? So I have a block valve. This is going to stop energy from this direction. This is going to stop energy from this direction. Now we're going to assume, and we should always assume within a line break, that these are going to fail. This valve and this valve are going to fail. And so let's say that we close the inlet valve and close the outlet valve. We place a lock on that valve. We're doing energy control right now. We're going to put a lock on the breaker down here, right? So we're going to stop the pump, put a lock on the breaker, lock here, and now what we need to do is we need to relieve stored energy, and we know that we have stored energy in between here. right? So this is all filled with stored energy. So we need to relieve that stored energy. We open these valves, right? Well, when you open those valves, that is exposing you to this hazardous energy. So that would be a line break. Opening that valve is a first line breaker equipment opening. So you should be in a line break process at that point in time. Now we're inside of a lockout tagout procedure, so that's where line break, you can kind of see, is incorporated. So this is where a lot of folks will go wrong. They'll say, well, we do line break after this, and no, line break's here. You have to assume that this is not going to close, and this one here is not. Both of these are leaking by. I open this valve and I could have material coming out on me. Hopefully that answered that question. Okay, so there's another question. With your experience, could you provide some examples of good faith in relation to the 3-year compliance audits pushed out because of the recent pandemic? It's a good question. In fact, if you don't mind sending me an email, I actually published an article on this particular item itself. You know, from a standpoint of compliance, we still have to comply. You know, so for the most part, I do know a number of OSHA folks that are hunkered down. So the only time that they actually go out and do inspections right now is if there's an incident, and then it's kind of limited on what they're doing. But there's a number of things that we can do from a compliance standpoint to still stay in compliance. Actually, we've done, I think, 7 compliance audits since this started. We do most of that compliance audit virtually. And so we can look a lot of documents, et cetera. We can interview employees virtually. We can do a number of things. And then we'll go back when things do get a little bit better, we'll go back and do any follow-up that we need to do. So for the most part, yes, you can continue to be in compliance with everything. In fact, like I said, if you send me your email, I'll be glad to send you that article. We also posted my article on LinkedIn, I think. You can go to our PSS LinkedIn page. You can actually see that article and download it. You can get it off our webpage. And it really has some good things to look at in terms of what we should be doing now with this pandemic going on. What are those things that we should be doing? I will say this, that now more than ever, we need to be more vigilant, you know, because most of our folks have got their minds on other things other than their process and some of the tasks at hand. So making sure that we're addressing all of our hazards and making sure that our folks are involved is pretty important. Okay, so here's another question. We were talking about line break. What about for changing a gauge that's attached to small 1/4 inch valve? Is this lotto? That's a good question. That's a question I get asked quite often. And actually, that would not be lotto. It would be part of your normal servicing process. So it could fall under the servicing element within the lockout tagout standard. One of the things I always tell people, when in doubt, for example, and this might be one that, you know, some may doubt, well, maybe it is lockout tagout, maybe it's not. If you're in doubt, put it in your SOP. So if part of your SOP, if you have an SOP for changing and revising, for example, changing relief valves, changing, I'm trying to think of some of the other, here's a good one, you know, changing your pressure gauges, et cetera. Develop an SOP for doing that. And now that SOP allows you to do those things without actually going through a lockout tagout procedure. As long as it's proceduralized and everything else, you could actually do that as well. Same way with filters. You know, a lot of people do not do lockout tagout to change a filter because they've been proceduralized, et cetera. And that's part of your maintenance process that you can use in lockout tagout. Hopefully that answered that one. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay. All right. So trying to get rid of that. Hold on a minute. I'm going to get rid of this stuff I have here. There we go. We'll try to get rid of that. Now I can open up the phone lines. If anybody wants to unmute themselves, you can certainly ask me questions that way, or if you want to do the Q&A, that's fine too. So we'll give you everybody a few minutes to ask their questions if you would like. So the next one we're going to have will be next month, and we're going to be talking about contractor and contractor management. This is a good one. We see a lot of issues through contractors, and specifically qualifications, and what are those things that they actually being trained on to come into work in your facilities. For example, last week or a couple of weeks ago at this facility, when we were doing a compliance audit, we got to the contractors and we were asking questions. We found out that the contractors that were coming in to do work were only being trained on the awareness level in lockout tagout, and actually performing lockout tagout at the authorized level. So so making sure that your contractors have the right training, even though their training documents showed that they were trained on lockout tagout, they were not trained at the authorized level. So there's a lot of things within contractors that can really help improve our process safety at our facilities. So again, any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions. And if not, obviously, hopefully you enjoyed today, and let us know if you have anything else. I do have a question here. I guess I don't. But anyway, oh, here's another one. Are the prior WebExes recorded? No, I didn't record those WebExes. We're going to start this all over again. We've had a lot of good participation in these, so we're going to start these again. I normally do one of these a month, but I'm going to probably start doing 2 of these a month, going back on some of these others. I always like the opportunity for people to ask questions like this. I think we learn a lot more when we get the opportunity to ask a question. So be glad to start those again, and hopefully you can join us there. Okay, well, thank you all. I think that's all I have for today. And again, thank you so much for participating today. And I hope you'll enjoy us for the contractor series next month. Y'all have a great day.